years ago, when my husband was my boyfriend, he used to travel a lot for work. And when he did, I would have a ritual. I would binge watch Law and Order. Now, I'm just going to pause for a moment so you can all hear the dun-dun in your head. There's something oddly soothing about that sound. For a show that's all about crime and violence, I think it's soothing because it has such a predictable formula. For those of you who aren't familiar with the formula, it goes something like this. Something really horrible happens. A murder, an abduction, something really bad. But then, help arrives. The detectives show up. They gather the clues, they ask the questions, and they do this all with a singular purpose: to take the horrible thing that's happened and make it right again. Now, the fanfare of the show is mostly focused on the detectives, but I've always had a soft spot for the second half of the formula, for the lawyers. Once the detectives are done gathering all the information, it's the lawyers that take that information and use the law and the rules to fight for what's right. For me in the show, it was always kind of the law that was the hero. Now, I loved living in that world for 42 minutes at a time. But in the real world, we know that law is not always the hero. Sometimes law is the villain. It's been a couple of years since my binge-watching days. I'm now a professor of political science and international affairs at Penn State. I hold an appointment with the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, and I co-host the Democracy Works podcast for the McCourtney Institute for Democracy. I research and I teach about human rights and the painful, often violent moments in which those rights are violated. I still watch Law and Order, and I still give a little cheer when the lawyers enter the room, but today I want to talk to you about the cases in which law is not the hero. I want to talk to you about something called lawfare, when instead of protecting our rights, laws punish us and take those rights away instead. Most of us grow up thinking about laws as neutral or impartial. We believe that laws are created to keep us safe and to keep us free. But here's the truth. Laws are just rules, and rules are only as fair or impartial as the people who put them in place. If any of you have ever watched a group of 7-year-olds on the playground, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There's always one kid that wants to make up a rule for everybody else. I'm in charge, and you can only play if I say you can play. Or, I'm the queen, and we're all going to do exactly what I want. Or, today, we're all going to be hamsters. These rules are random, uneven, even ridiculous, but they all have a very clear purpose. They benefit the person who's putting the rules in place. And adults aren't much better. Our laws are just rules that are put in place to benefit the person that's creating them. They can be fair and impartial, designed to protect, or uneven and arbitrary, designed to control. This second category is called lawfare. And lawfare is when the rulemaker puts rules in place that benefit them. It's when the government designs laws that are meant to take our rights away instead of protecting our rights. Now, when we think about governments taking our rights away, we tend to think about things like torture, assassination, slavery. Lawfare doesn't look like that. Lawfare doesn't look like tanks in the streets or a dictator pounding his fist on a balcony. Lawfare looks like court decisions, like fines, like administrative burdens. Lawfare looks deceptively normal, and that is what makes it so dangerous. Lawfare is happening all around the world today, in democracies, in autocracies, in wealthy nations, and in developing ones. No country is immune. In Bangladesh, new rules have been put in place that make it almost impossible for civil society organizations that advocate for press freedoms to exist legally. In Hungary, new laws have been passed that prevent the gathering of groups that advocate for LGBTQ rights. And in China, simply posting a meme that's derogatory towards the government can have you punished under expansive cybersecurity laws. In these cases, the laws are not protecting the citizens of those countries. The laws are protecting the government. Now, lawfare is relatively new, but the idea behind it is not at all. When we think about governments committing human rights violations, we tend to think about dramatic, violent events. We think about things like the Holocaust, or the Russian gulags, or the Rwandan genocide. Governments have always taken away rights. And in each of these events, millions of people lost their lives. But they also lost their rights to protest, to assemble, to vote, to engage independent media, and to seek protection from the police. And these were not events that were committed by fringe extremists or criminal groups. These were events that were committed by governments, by institutions, by individuals wearing uniforms and following the rules. Conservative estimates suggest that governments killed over 200 million of their own citizens in the 20th century. That is more people than the total deaths of World War I and World War II combined. But there is some good news. Following the signing of the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, overt physical violence by governments has been on the decline. But this decline isn't the whole story, because governments didn't stop abusing rights. They just got quieter about how they do it. Let me tell you how that happened. Following World War II, the world changed dramatically. We created new institutions, like the United Nations. We signed new treaties, like the Convention Against Torture. And governments around the world promised that never again would they stand by and watch other governments abuse their citizens at such atrocious levels. For the first time in human history, governments were paying attention to other governments. Civil society groups had broad global networks. Journalists could share stories around the world almost instantly, and citizens had new tools that allowed them to record abuses and to share them. We were better informed and better protected than ever before, and people used that information to vote, to boycott, to divest, and to shame governments into better behavior. For a moment, it really looked like human rights were going to triumph over government power. But then, governments adapted. Governments decided that it was too costly to use conventional strategies of violence to violate human rights and maintain their power. And so, instead of breaking the law, governments started to change the law. Instead of using soldiers and guns, governments started using courtrooms and paperwork. Why send soldiers in to break up a protest when you can simply change the law to make that protest illegal? Why jail journalists when you can create new rules that ban them from the press room? And why shut down universities when you can change accreditation rules to control what's being taught? No bloodshed, no condemnation, and technically, no broken laws. I want to tell you the story of Alexei Navalny. Navalny was a prominent opposition politician in Russia. He was a tireless advocate for democracy and human rights. Navalny exposed the corruption and injustices of Putin's regime. Navalny directly threatened the Putin government and challenged his hold on power. Now, the Russian government could have had Navalny assassinated, but that ran the risk of drawing international condemnation and making Navalny a martyr for the cause of democracy in Russia. So instead, the Russian government used lawfare. Navalny was charged with fraud and embezzlement through Russia's expansive cybersecurity laws. And through these laws, well, we could all see that they were incredibly politically motivated. It made it really difficult for civil society and foreign governments to rally to Navalny's aid because, after all, Russia was allowed to uphold its own laws. The Russian government used lawfare against Alexei Navalny, and Navalny died in prison 2 years ago. Lawfare is a quieter form of repression, but it is no less brutal, and that is what makes it so effective. Lawfare takes laws and uses many of the same careful legal forms and legal language as the laws that are designed to protect our rights. Lawfare looks legitimate on paper. Now, as a social scientist, I really struggle because lawfare is so incredibly difficult to measure. We can observe human rights abuses in newspaper articles or NGO reports, but it's very difficult to get at a government's intent. Let me give you some examples. Anti-terror laws are an incredibly effective strategy at protecting national security interests, but they can also be used to criminalize dissent. Election reform can be useful for preventing voter fraud, but it can also be used to systematically disenfranchise targeted populations. And categorizing or cataloging groups can be a really important mechanism for distributing social services and other types of benefits. But it's also the first step towards genocide. Lawfare is incredibly difficult to measure, but I try to remember that hiding their behaviors is exactly what governments are trying to do. This is a scary moment for the law. We can no longer pretend that when something horrible happens, lawyers are going to swoop in like those from my favorite TV show. But the 20th century has given us something incredibly important. The history of human rights has given us a strategy that we know works. Following World War II, governments didn't change their behavior because they wanted to. They changed their behavior because people were paying attention. Global attention changed behavior. And so we have a strategy right now for resisting lawfare in our own country and around the world. The first step to resisting lawfare is to be able to recognize lawfare. Lawfare draws its power because we all assume that laws are neutral. But remember those seven-year-olds on the playground? If you know that laws can be weaponized to support the person in power, then you are already way ahead in your ability to identify and challenge these rules when you see them. The second step to resisting lawfare is to pay attention to the judiciary. The judiciary is the branch of government that interprets and upholds the law. In many parts of the world, like the United States, judicial positions are elected. We can vote for local judges, even state Supreme Court justices. These are the people that shape the laws that shape our lives. And while it may not be particularly glamorous to research which judge you're going to vote for in the next election cycle, judges matter, courts matter, and your vote should reflect your preferences. The third step to resisting lawfare is to become an engaged global citizen. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. This is not just a moral statement, but a political truth. Raise your awareness, engage global events, and that will teach you the lessons that you need to identify and resist lawfare in your own backyard. I still watch Law & Order, and I still get a little excited when the lawyers rush into that bright wood-paneled courtroom. But real life is not a predictable TV drama. The law is powerful, but it's very fragile. And the law becomes dangerous when we stop paying attention to it. Our job is to keep the law honest, to keep the law accountable, to ensure that the law will be a tool for justice and not injustice, and to ensure that the law helps and supports our human rights, not take them away. The law can still be the hero of our story, but only if we insist on being the hero behind it.